The poor nurse paid for a strange, old woman's medicine, unaware her grandson was a mafia boss. Why would a poor nurse choose to pay for a stranger's medicine? And what could happen when someone has no idea who another person is? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy emotional stories filled with unexpected twists, heartfelt moments, and unforgettable journeys, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you so much for being here and for supporting this channel with your time and encouragement. Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Would you help a complete stranger if you had very little yourself? Now, settle in, relax, and let this remarkable story unfold from the very first moment that changed everything. The people who have the least are often the ones who give the most, because they still remember what it feels like to go without. By the time my shift finally ended, the digital clock above the emergency department read 7:42 in the evening. 14 hours had slipped past beneath fluorescent lights, endless monitor alarms, hurried footsteps, and the familiar scent of antiseptic that clung stubbornly to my scrubs no matter how many times I washed them. My feet ached inside shoes that had carried me through 12 patient rooms, 3 emergency admissions, and more quiet reassurances than I could count. Mercy Memorial Hospital had been especially busy that Thursday. An elderly man thanked me for holding his hand while he waited for test results. A little girl insisted my cartoon bandage made her feel brave. A young mother cried with relief when her fever finally broke. Those moments reminded me why I became a nurse, even on the days when my bank account suggested I should have chosen a different career. I stepped outside into the cool spring evening and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of rain that had fallen earlier, carrying the clean scent of wet pavement mixed with blooming cherry trees lining the hospital entrance. My old sedan waited in the employee parking lot, but the fuel gauge had been resting below empty since yesterday. Payday was still 2 days away. Walking. The mile home would have to do. Before leaving, I stopped at the neighborhood pharmacy to pick up the generic allergy medication I had promised myself for weeks. Seasonal pollen never cared whether someone could afford another expense. I reached into my wallet while standing in line and quietly counted what remained. 2 $20 bills. That was all. $40 until Friday morning. Rent had already emptied my checking account. My student loan payment was due next week. I smiled anyway. Somehow, worrying had never made numbers grow larger. Only patience ever helped. The automatic doors opened behind me with a soft chime as an elderly woman slowly entered the pharmacy. Her silver hair was neatly pinned beneath a light blue scarf, and she leaned gently against a polished wooden cane that looked almost as old as the leather handbag hanging from her arm. She smiled politely at everyone she passed before taking her place at the prescription counter. There was something quietly graceful about her, the kind of dignity that remained even when life became difficult. I barely noticed her again until I heard the pharmacist speak in an apologetic voice. "I am sorry, ma'am, but your insurance rejected this refill. The total today is $112.80. The woman carefully opened her wallet, counted several folded bills, then paused. Her gentle smile faded only slightly. "I only have $73. She looked embarrassed, not angry. The pharmacist sighed sympathetically. "Would you like me to hold the prescription until tomorrow?" She glanced at the small paper bag containing her heart medication before quietly shaking her head. "Tomorrow may be too late." The words were almost whispered, yet somehow they echoed louder than every conversation inside the pharmacy. The customers waiting behind her shifted impatiently. One man checked his watch. Another woman looked away, pretending not to notice. I stared at the 2 $20 bills still resting in my hand. $40. Every dollar I had left. Common sense told me to stay quiet. Bills did not disappear simply because someone else needed help. But another voice, one that sounded strangely like my late mother's, gently reminded me that compassion had never been measured by convenience. Before I had time to overthink it, I stepped forward and placed my money on the counter. "Please use this," I said softly. The elderly woman turned toward me with eyes full of surprised gratitude. "My dear," she whispered, "you cannot possibly know what this means." I smiled and shrugged. "Maybe not, but I know what it feels like to need a little help." She gently reached for my hand instead of the money, holding it with surprising warmth despite her trembling fingers. For a brief moment, she simply looked at me, as though memorizing my face. Then she smiled with quiet certainty and said, "Kindness always remembers its way home." I laughed softly, believing those were simply the comforting words of a grateful stranger. I had no way of knowing that as I walked out of the pharmacy carrying nothing but my empty wallet and a lighter heart, a black Rolls-Royce had just pulled silently into the parking lot, and someone inside had witnessed everything. The walk home felt longer than usual, although I suspected it only seemed that way because my wallet was now completely empty. My sneakers splashed gently through shallow puddles left behind by the afternoon rain, while the cool evening breeze carried the distant sound of traffic across the neighborhood. I reached automatically into my jacket pocket for my car keys before remembering there was no gasoline left to justify driving anywhere. Instead, I smiled quietly to myself. Somehow, the thought did not bother me as much as I expected. I had learned years ago that worrying about what I no longer had never helped me appreciate what I still did. Across the parking lot of the pharmacy, the black Rolls-Royce remained motionless beneath the glow of a street lamp. Its engine idled almost silently while the elderly woman carefully settled into the rear passenger seat. A tall man wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat leaned slightly toward her before gently fastening her seat belt. "Did you have trouble getting your prescription, grandmother?" he asked with calm concern. Margaret smiled softly, still thinking about the young nurse she had just met. "Not trouble," she answered. "A miracle." Damien Rousseau looked at her with quiet curiosity. "A miracle?" She nodded as the chauffeur slowly pulled away from the curb. "The pharmacist told me my insurance rejected the refill. I was nearly $40 short." Damien frowned slightly. "Why did you not call me?" Margaret laughed gently. "Because before I could, a young woman stepped forward and paid the difference." Damien remained silent. His grandmother rarely described strangers with such emotion. "Did she know who you were?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "No. She believed I was simply an old woman who needed help." She looked out the window as the city lights reflected across the glass. She counted the money in her own wallet before helping me. I saw it with my own eyes. She gave me everything she had left. Those final words lingered inside the quiet luxury sedan. Damien glanced toward the pharmacy disappearing in the distance before speaking again. "Did she ask for anything?" Margaret smiled. "Nothing. Not your name." "No." "Your phone number?" "No." Margaret's smile grew warmer. She only smiled and wished me a safe evening. Damien looked thoughtfully toward the passing streets. During most days, he met people who wanted meetings, favors, introductions, investments, or opportunities. Every conversation carried an expectation hidden somewhere beneath polite words. Yet according to his grandmother, one exhausted nurse had quietly emptied her wallet for a complete stranger without asking even a single question. "Did you happen to learn her name?" he asked. Margaret nodded. Her identification badge was still clipped to her scrubs. "Grace Mitchell." Damien repeated the name once in his mind before falling silent again. Back at my apartment, I unlocked the door and set my nearly empty tote bag onto the kitchen counter. The refrigerator greeted me with exactly what I expected. Half a carton of eggs. A container of yogurt that expired tomorrow. One apple. I laughed softly, cracked 2 eggs into a pan, and reminded myself that payday was only 48 hours away. While dinner cooked, my phone vibrated with a notification from my bank confirming my account balance had reached exactly $0.18. I stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly setting the phone face down. It looked frightening on paper, yet strangely peaceful inside my heart. Somewhere an elderly woman would be able to take the medicine she needed tonight. Somehow that thought outweighed every number displayed on the screen. Across the city, Damien stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, looking down at thousands of glowing lights scattered across Chicago. "Grace Mitchell," he repeated quietly to himself. Then he turned toward his longtime advisor, standing nearby. "Tomorrow morning," he said in his usual calm voice, "I want to know everything there is to know about the nurse who believed kindness was worth $40 she could not afford to lose." Payday arrived with exactly the amount of relief I expected and none of the miracle I secretly hoped for. My checking account finally showed enough money to refill the gas tank, buy groceries for the week, and pay the overdue electric bill that had been sitting on my kitchen counter like an unwelcome guest. It was not much, but after seeing my balance fall to 18 cents, it felt like abundance. By 6:30 that morning, I was already walking through the familiar entrance of Mercy Memorial Hospital with a paper cup of coffee warming my hands. Nurses greeted one another with tired smiles, while doctors hurried toward morning rounds carrying tablets and patient charts. Another long shift had begun. I tied my hair into a ponytail, clipped my identification badge onto fresh navy scrubs, and reminded myself that every patient deserved my full attention regardless of how little sleep I had managed the night before. Across the city, Damien sat alone in his office overlooking the Chicago skyline, while a slim folder rested unopened on his desk. Vincent entered quietly before placing a second folder beside it. "Everything we found is here," he said. Damien nodded once before opening the report. Grace Mitchell, 27 years old. Registered nurse at Mercy Memorial Hospital. Graduated near the top of her nursing class. While working evenings to pay tuition. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No luxury purchases. One aging sedan. One modest apartment. Student loans. Volunteer hours at a free neighborhood health clinic twice every month. Damien continued reading without interruption. The report contained nothing extraordinary by the standards of his world. No influential family. No political connections. No hidden fortune. Yet one page caught his attention. It listed several commendations from patients who had written letters praising Grace for staying beyond the end of her shift simply to comfort frightened families. None of those extra hours had been paid. Vincent watched quietly before speaking. "She appears exactly as your grandmother described." Damien closed the folder slowly. "No," he replied. "She appears even more unusual." He looked toward the city below. "Most people become generous after life gives them enough." His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "She chose generosity before life did." Later that afternoon, I stopped by the hospital cafeteria for a late lunch that consisted of vegetable soup and a banana. While searching for an empty table, I noticed one of our custodians sitting alone near the window. Mr. Alvarez usually greeted everyone with cheerful jokes, but today he looked distracted. I carried my tray over and asked if everything was all right. He smiled politely before admitting his wife had recently been admitted to another hospital several counties away, and traveling to visit her every evening had become difficult. We spent 20 minutes talking about ordinary things that somehow made difficult days feel lighter. Before returning to work, I quietly handed him the unused gas gift card a grateful patient's family had given me the previous month. "I still have enough fuel to get home," I said before he could refuse. "Your wife needs you more than my car needs another tank." His eyes filled with grateful surprise. "Grace, you are always helping someone." I laughed softly. "Someday someone else will help me." I believed those words because my mother had spent my entire childhood repeating the same lesson. Kindness was never an investment expecting profit. It was simply the right thing to do. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hospital parking garage, Margaret Russo folded her hands around a warm cup of tea inside her elegant sitting room and listened patiently while Damien described everything he had learned. When he finally finished, she smiled exactly as she had in the pharmacy. "You see," she asked gently, "good hearts still exist." Damien looked thoughtfully into his untouched coffee before answering. "I would like to meet her." Margaret's smile grew wider. "Do not meet her because you feel you owe her something." She paused long enough for him to meet her eyes. "Meet her because people like Grace remind us who we could become if we stopped measuring life by what we own instead of what we give." Saturday morning arrived wrapped in soft sunshine and the quiet promise of a slower day. After 6 exhausting shifts in a row, I finally had one precious morning without hospital alarms or endless patient charts waiting for me. I planned to sleep late, catch up on laundry, and maybe finish the novel that had been sitting untouched beside my bed for nearly a month. Instead, my phone rang just after 8 o'clock. The caller identification displayed Mercy Memorial Hospital. I answered immediately. "Grace speaking." "Good morning," the charge nurse said apologetically. "I know today is your day off, but one of our cardiac nurses called in sick. Would you be willing to cover just a few hours?" I smiled before she could even finish asking. "I will be there in 30 minutes. My apartment could wait. Patients rarely could. By 9 o'clock, I was walking through the familiar cardiac wing once again, greeting coworkers who looked both surprised and relieved to see me. The morning passed quickly between medication rounds, discharge paperwork, and reassuring conversations with anxious families. Shortly after noon, I received a message from the front reception desk asking if I could assist an elderly outpatient who seemed slightly unsteady after a routine examination. I walked toward the waiting area without thinking twice. The moment I stepped through the doors, I recognized the familiar blue scarf before I saw her face. Margaret Russo looked up from her chair and smiled warmly. "Well," she said softly, "it seems kindness remembers faster than I expected." I laughed in surprise. "It is wonderful to see you again." I gently checked her blood pressure, reviewed the physician's instructions, and helped her adjust the light blanket resting across her knees. "Everything looks good," I assured her. "You simply need a little rest before heading home." Margaret watched me with the same quiet warmth she had shown inside the pharmacy. "You take care of everyone as though they belong to your own family." I shrugged with a small smile. "That is how I hope someone would care for mine." Before she could answer, the automatic doors opened behind me. A tall man wearing a dark gray suit stepped calmly into the waiting area. I recognized him almost immediately from the photograph Margaret kept inside a small silver frame beside her chair. He approached with measured confidence, but there was nothing intimidating about the gentle way he bent slightly to kiss his grandmother's forehead. "I hope I did not keep you waiting," he said. Margaret smiled. "Not at all. Grace has been keeping me excellent company." He turned toward me with unmistakable recognition in his eyes, though his expression remained composed. "We have not met properly," he said, extending his hand. "I am Damien." I accepted the handshake with a polite smile. "Grace." His handshake was firm without trying to impress, and for a brief moment I noticed genuine gratitude behind his calm expression. "My grandmother has spoken very highly of you," he said. I felt slightly embarrassed. I only helped someone who needed help. Margaret chuckled quietly. She insists on making every extraordinary thing sound ordinary. Damien looked toward his grandmother before meeting my eyes again. Some things deserve to be remembered. Before leaving, Margaret gently reached into her handbag and removed a small folded card. "This is my personal number," she said. "Not because I expect another favor. Because I would like to know the young woman who reminded me that kindness still lives in this city." I hesitated only for a second before accepting it. With a grateful smile, as I watched them walk toward the hospital entrance together, I noticed something unusual. Despite the elegant suit, the waiting chauffeur, and the expensive black sedan parked outside, Damien never walked ahead of his grandmother. He matched every slow step she took, adjusting his pace without impatience, holding the door only after making certain she felt steady enough to continue. For reasons I could not quite explain, that simple gesture stayed with me long after they disappeared from sight. The card Margaret had given me remained tucked safely inside my wallet for nearly a week before I finally gathered the courage to use it. I never intended to ask for anything. I simply wanted to know whether she was feeling better after her appointment. Late Wednesday afternoon, during my lunch break, I stepped outside the hospital and dialed the number while sitting on a quiet bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. Margaret answered on the second ring with unmistakable warmth. "Grace," she said before I could introduce myself. "I hoped you would call." I smiled, surprised she recognized my voice so quickly. "I just wanted to see how you were feeling." "Much better," she replied. "In fact, my grandson insists I have recovered enough to enjoy lunch somewhere other than my own dining room tomorrow. Would you consider joining us?" I hesitated. My first instinct was to politely decline. Between work, bills, and endless responsibilities, leisurely lunches belong to other people's schedules, not mine. Margaret seemed to sense my uncertainty immediately. "Please do not think of it as a favor," she said gently. "Think of it as allowing an old woman to spend an afternoon with someone she genuinely enjoys." I laughed softly. "When you put it that way, how could I refuse?" The following afternoon, I arrived at a small family-owned Italian cafe, several blocks away from the hospital. It was nothing like the expensive restaurants I imagined people with elegant black sedans preferred. Red brick walls, checkered tablecloths, framed photographs of Chicago from decades ago, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread made the little restaurant feel welcoming from the moment I stepped inside. Margaret waved enthusiastically from a corner booth, while Damien stood politely as I approached. "You found the place," he said with an easy smile. "Only after walking past it once," I admitted, laughing at myself. Lunch unfolded with surprising comfort. Margaret told stories about growing up in Chicago before the skyline filled with glass towers. I shared funny moments from the hospital that never violated anyone's privacy, but reminded us all how wonderfully unpredictable people could be. Damien listened more than he spoke, though whenever he did join the conversation, his observations carried quiet thoughtfulness rather than an effort to impress. When the server arrived with the check, I instinctively reached for my purse. Damien gently shook his head. "Please allow me." I smiled apologetically. "Then next time, coffee is my treat." Margaret looked between us with unmistakable amusement. "I believe that sounds perfectly fair." After lunch, we walked slowly through a nearby public garden where spring flowers covered every pathway with bright colors. Margaret eventually paused beside a bench overlooking a small fountain. "My knees are requesting a brief negotiation," she joked. Damien and I both laughed before sitting beside her. While Margaret admired the tulips blooming nearby, Damien turned toward me. "My grandmother told me why you paid for her medicine." I looked down at my hands, slightly embarrassed by the attention. It was not a very complicated decision. $40 can be complicated when someone does not have $40 to spare, he replied quietly. I looked at him, surprised he knew the exact amount. Before I could ask how, he continued. "She also told me you never asked for her name or expected anything in return." I shrugged. Helping someone feels different when it comes with conditions. Damien remained silent for a long moment before speaking again. "You have probably changed more lives than you realize." I smiled politely, believing he was simply being kind. What I did not realize was that while we sat beneath the warm afternoon sun talking about ordinary things, Damien had already instructed his foundation. Earlier that morning to quietly increase its annual donation to Mercy Memorial Hospital, making certain the gift would remain completely anonymous because, for the first time in many years, gratitude felt more meaningful when nobody knew where it came from. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that afternoon in the garden, although I could never quite explain why ordinary days seemed a little brighter than they had only a few weeks before. My schedule remained just as demanding. 12-hour shifts blurred into one another, patient charts continued to pile up, and my apartment still greeted me every evening with the same modest furniture and unpaid student loan statements waiting patiently on the kitchen table. Yet somewhere between those ordinary routines, I found myself exchanging occasional messages with Damien and receiving cheerful phone calls from Margaret that somehow made the city feel a little smaller. One Monday morning, Mercy Memorial Hospital gathered the nursing staff for an unexpected meeting before the beginning of our shifts. Our chief administrator stood beside several large covered carts with an expression I had never seen before. "We received an anonymous donation over the weekend," she announced. Curious whispers spread across the room. She smiled warmly before pulling away the protective covers. Brand new patient monitoring equipment, portable ultrasound devices, and updated infusion pumps filled the carts. For several seconds, nobody spoke. We simply stared. "The donor requested complete privacy," she continued. "The only message included with the gift was this: every patient deserves to be treated with dignity, and every caregiver deserves the tools to make that possible." Applause filled the conference room almost immediately. Some of the senior nurses quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Our department had spent years requesting updated equipment through budget proposals that never quite reached the top of the priority list. Now, somehow, everything had changed overnight. I smiled along with everyone else, believing somewhere there was simply a generous stranger who cared about people they would probably never meet. Later that afternoon, my phone vibrated with a message from Margaret inviting me to visit her for tea the following Sunday. She insisted homemade lemon cake tasted much better when shared with company. I happily accepted. When Sunday arrived, Damien met me outside the elegant townhouse where Margaret had lived for decades. The home surprised me. It was beautiful without feeling extravagant, filled with books, family photographs, fresh flowers, and the unmistakable warmth of a place where memories mattered more than expensive decorations. Margaret welcomed me with the same affectionate smile that had first comforted me inside the pharmacy. We spent hours talking about childhood stories, favorite recipes, forgotten family traditions, and the changing neighborhoods of Chicago. At one point, Margaret excused herself to check something in the kitchen, leaving Damien and me alone on the back porch overlooking a peaceful garden filled with roses beginning to bloom. "How is the hospital?" he asked. "Busy as always," I answered with a smile. although something incredible happened this week. His expression remained politely curious. I described the anonymous donation with genuine excitement, explaining how much easier it would become to care for patients using reliable equipment instead of machines older than some of our newest nurses. Damien listened quietly without interrupting. Whoever made that donation, I finally said, understands that helping caregivers also helps every patient who walks through those doors. He looked toward the roses swaying gently in the afternoon breeze before replying. Perhaps they simply wanted to thank someone who reminded them what kindness looks like. I smiled, assuming he was speaking philosophically rather than personally. If that is true, I answered, I hope they know they made a difference. Damien did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched a butterfly drift slowly across Margaret's garden with the same thoughtful expression I had come to recognize whenever something mattered deeply to him. At that very moment, a sleek black luxury sedan quietly pulled into the driveway beyond the garden gate. A well-dressed man stepped out carrying several folders before pausing respectfully when he noticed me. He nodded toward Damien and addressed him in a calm, professional voice. Sir, the council members are waiting for your decision. They said the entire organization will move only after receiving your final approval. I looked toward Damien with quiet curiosity, realizing for the first time that the calm businessman sitting beside me might be carrying responsibilities far greater than he had ever chosen to mention. The words lingered in my mind long after the man disappeared into the house, carrying his folders. The entire organization will move only after receiving your final approval. It was not the kind of sentence people usually said to an ordinary businessman. I looked toward Damien, expecting him to explain, but he simply offered an apologetic smile. Work has an unfortunate habit of following me everywhere, he said. His tone remained calm, almost effortless, yet something about it felt carefully measured. I nodded politely, deciding not to ask questions that were clearly not mine to ask. Everyone deserved parts of their life they chose to keep private. Margaret returned carrying a tray filled with fresh tea, slices of lemon cake, and warm blueberry scones, instantly replacing the brief moment of uncertainty with laughter. We spent another hour talking about travel, favorite books, and the small vegetable garden Margaret proudly maintained every spring. By the time I left that afternoon, I found myself smiling during the drive home without quite understanding why. 2 days later, my answer arrived unexpectedly. During a quiet break between patients, one of the younger nurses excitedly placed a business magazine on the staff lounge table. Look who made the cover this month, she said. Curious voices gathered around almost immediately. I glanced down without much interest, then froze. Damien looked back at me from the glossy front page. The headline described him as one of the most influential private business leaders in Chicago, praising the remarkable reach of the Russo family enterprises across real estate, international logistics, private investment groups, and charitable foundations. Another article mentioned that despite his extraordinary influence, he rarely appeared in interviews and almost never attended public events unless they supported community organizations. My coworkers continued discussing the article while I quietly stepped away with the magazine still in my hands. The photograph showed the same composed expression I already knew. Yet somehow the distance between the elegant executive on the cover and the thoughtful man who listened patiently over tea suddenly felt much larger. That evening, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. I searched publicly available news articles about Damien and the Russo family. Most described successful businesses, philanthropy, and decades of influence throughout the city. Others hinted at whispered rumors connecting the family to organized crime many years earlier, though none offered proof beyond speculation and anonymous sources. The internet seemed divided between admiration and suspicion. I closed my laptop feeling more confused than informed. The following afternoon, Damien sent a simple message asking whether I would like to meet for coffee after my shift. I almost declined, not because I was frightened, but because I disliked uncertainty. Instead, I answered honestly. We met at the same quiet cafe where sunlight filtered through wide front windows onto polished wooden tables. Damien immediately noticed I seemed quieter than usual. Something is on your mind, he observed gently. I looked at him for several seconds before sliding the folded business magazine across the table. I saw this yesterday. He glanced at the cover, then nodded almost imperceptibly. I wondered when you might. There was no surprise in his voice. No attempt to avoid the conversation. I folded my hands around the warm coffee cup before asking the only question that truly mattered. Why did you never tell me who you really were? Damien remained silent long enough to gather his thoughts. Finally, he looked directly into my eyes with complete honesty. Because the first time we met, you saw my grandmother before you ever had the chance to see my name. I wanted to know the person who helped her without expecting anything in return, and I hoped you could know the man sitting across from you before the rest of the world decided who I was supposed to be. His answer left the table wrapped in thoughtful silence. For the first time since leaving Margaret's garden, I realized the real question was no longer who Damien Russo was. It was whether I was willing to judge him by rumors, or by every quiet act of kindness I had witnessed with my own eyes. The conversation stayed with me long after we left the cafe that afternoon. I walked home beneath a sky filled with slow-moving clouds, replaying every word Damien had spoken. He had never denied carrying influence. He had never claimed his family lived an ordinary life. He had simply asked me to judge him by what I had personally seen instead of what strangers chose to believe. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. Every meaningful thing I knew about him had come from quiet moments rather than headlines. I had seen him care patiently for his grandmother. I had watched him treat restaurant servers and hospital receptionists with the same respect he offered executives. I had witnessed his gratitude without display and his generosity without expectation of recognition. None of those moments felt rehearsed. A week later, Mercy Memorial Hospital held a small appreciation ceremony for employees and community supporters who had contributed to recent improvements throughout the cardiac department. Most of us assumed it would be another brief gathering with coffee, pastries, and polite speeches before returning to work. Instead, the hospital administrator surprised everyone by announcing a new patient assistance program that would help families struggling to afford essential medications after discharge. The room immediately filled with warm applause. "The donor has requested complete anonymity," she explained. "The only message included with this gift says, compassion should never depend on a person's ability to pay." Those words settled quietly inside my heart. They sounded strangely familiar. They reminded me of the pharmacy, of $40, and of an elderly woman whose grateful smile had unexpectedly changed the direction of my life. After the ceremony ended, I remained in the hallway studying the new information board describing the assistance program. A volunteer approached carrying a stack of brochures. "Amazing, is it not?" she said. "Whoever made this possible must really understand what patients go through." I smiled. I think they probably understand kindness. That evening, Margaret invited me to dinner once again. Her dining room felt as welcoming as always, filled with fresh flowers and the comforting aroma of homemade soup. Halfway through the meal, she looked at Damien with a knowing smile before turning toward me. "There is something I believe you deserve to know." Damien did not interrupt her. He simply nodded gently. Margaret folded her hands together. "The anonymous gifts your hospital has been receiving were never random." I looked from her to Damien without speaking. "My grandson arranged them," she continued softly. "Not because he believed money could repay what you did for me, but because he wanted your patients to receive the same kindness you offered a complete stranger." I stared at Damien in quiet disbelief. He met my eyes with the same calm honesty I had come to trust. "You once told me that helping someone feels different when it comes with conditions," he said. I remembered those words. "That is why I never wanted you to know where the donations came from." I felt my eyes grow warm. "You never had to do any of that." He smiled gently. "No, I wanted to." Margaret reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over mine. "Grace, my grandson has spent much of his life surrounded by people who respected his position before they respected his character. You were the first person who treated our family with simple humanity before you knew anything about us." The room became wonderfully quiet. Outside, evening sunlight settled across Margaret's garden while birds sang somewhere beyond the open windows. In that peaceful silence, I finally understood that the greatest gift Damien had ever given me was not the equipment, the assistance program, or the anonymous generosity. It was the certainty that genuine kindness could still inspire kindness in return, quietly changing lives without asking for applause. And that realization prepared both of us for the final truth that still waited just beyond the horizon. 1 year passed more quickly than I ever imagined possible. Seasons changed. The cherry trees outside Mercy Memorial bloomed once again. and the hospital corridors continued to fill with the same mixture of hope, worry, exhaustion, and quiet courage that had first taught me what it truly meant to care for strangers. My own life looked different now, not because everything had suddenly become easy, but because I no longer carried every burden alone. The patient assistance program continued helping families who once faced impossible choices between paying bills and filling prescriptions. Every week, someone quietly left the pharmacy carrying medicine they thought they could never afford. They never knew whose generosity had made it possible, and somehow that made every story even more beautiful. One bright Saturday morning, the hospital invited staff, volunteers, and community partners to celebrate the first anniversary of the program. A simple ceremony had been arranged in the newly renovated Community Wellness Center. Fresh flowers decorated every table, children laughed in the courtyard outside, and photographs displayed the many lives touched during the past year. As I walked through the entrance, I noticed a bronze plaque mounted near the reception desk. It did not mention wealthy donors, influential families, or famous organizations. Instead, engraved across the center were 8 simple words. Kindness is always returned. I stood quietly reading them several times before smiling to myself. Margaret slowly joined me, resting one hand gently on my arm. "Do you recognize the sentence?" she asked. I laughed softly. "It sounds very familiar." She smiled with affectionate satisfaction. Because every beautiful story deserves to remember where it began. Damien approached a few moments later carrying 2 cups of coffee exactly the way he always did whenever we met. "I remembered," he said with a smile. "No sugar." I accepted the cup and laughed. "You still remember everything. Only the things that matter." We walked together through the wellness center while doctors greeted former patients, nurses embraced grateful families, and volunteers organized free health screenings for anyone who needed them. Watching so many people smiling beneath the afternoon sunlight, I suddenly understood how one small decision inside a neighborhood pharmacy had quietly echoed through hundreds of lives. It had never been about $40. It had never been about repayment. It had always been about giving someone else another reason to believe tomorrow could be better than today. Before the ceremony ended, the hospital director invited me to say a few words about the program. I stepped onto the small stage feeling far more nervous than I ever felt inside an emergency room. Looking across the audience, I saw patients, co-workers, Margaret, and Damien all watching with encouraging smiles. I took a slow breath before speaking. "People often ask when this program truly began," I said. "Some believe it started with a donation. Others think it started with a meeting or a partnership. I believe it started the moment one person looked at another human being and chose compassion instead of convenience." The room grew wonderfully quiet. "Kindness is never measured by the amount we give," I continued. "It is measured by the hope we leave behind." Warm applause filled the room as I stepped away from the microphone. Later that evening, Damien and I walked slowly through the hospital garden while Margaret rested on a nearby bench, happily watching the sunset paint the sky with soft shades of gold and pink. "Do you ever regret stopping at that pharmacy?" Damien asked quietly. I looked down at the bracelet resting around my wrist, then smiled as I gently shook my head. "Not for a single second." He smiled back with the same calm warmth that had first earned my trust long before I knew anything about his name or his influence. In that peaceful moment, I realized my mother had been right all along. Kindness never asks who deserves it before changing a life. Sometimes it reaches a stranger. Sometimes it reaches a family. And sometimes, when the timing is exactly right, it quietly finds its way home.